The house at the end of Gallows Lane. This is an account of one of the most bizarre haunted houses in recent memory, and it all begins with an unsuspecting family moving into their new home. Actually, to call the house new is a bit of a stretch. The house was actually quite old, but for the Kramer family, Douglas and his wife Kathy, their son Greg and daughter Emily, well, this was the home of their dreams. It was large, 3 stories in fact, and provided lots of room compared to the small 2-bedroom home they had just moved out of. It was situated outside of the city, at the end of Gallows Lane. The home had been built on a large tract of land that consisted of tall trees, swamps, and a backyard that was a large, empty field. A house of dreams, indeed. But for the Kramer family, the house of their dreams was about to become a nightmare. The Kramers moved into the house at the end of Gallows Lane on July 16th, 2 days before Greg's 12th birthday. A large semi-truck brought all of their belongings, and 2 days later, on Greg's birthday, they were completely settled in. Greg's birthday party was small, consisting only of the Kramer family, but they played games and ate pizza and birthday cake. At 10 o'clock, everyone went to bed. It was to be a frightful night. 7-year-old Emily was asleep in her bedroom on the first floor. The night was warm and her bedroom window was open. Around midnight, she was awakened by a soft voice from the field that was whispering her name. Emily. Not knowing exactly who it was, Emily did the wrong thing. She got up, walked to the back door, and went outside. A sliver of moon, like a large thumbnail, glowed high in the dark sky. Emily stood on the porch, peering into the darkness. She called out to the voice, but her reply was only received with silence. Suddenly, she saw something move. Something in the field was coming toward her. It was a misty, wisping form, glowing with soft light. Emily grew fearful, but she remained on the porch, watching the figure come toward her. Soon, she could see that the thing coming toward her was human. Sort of. It was a young woman, probably 18 or 19 years old. The figure stopped several feet in front of the porch. She was now glowing so brightly that Emily couldn't make out any of the young woman's features, except her bright outline against the dark field behind her. Emily trembled with fear, too afraid to say or do anything. Suddenly, the ghostly young woman whispered again.
Leave this house now.
Then, without another word, the young woman walked back into the dark field and vanished. In the morning, Emily told her family about what she'd seen. Her mother told her that it was probably just a dream and scolded her for going outside in the middle of the night. Emily stuck with her story, though, insisting that she had seen the ghostly figure of a young woman in the field and that the figure had spoken to her. Soon, her family would believe her, but not before Greg was to have his own terrifying experience with ghostly apparitions. A week had gone by since Emily's strange encounter with the young woman. The Kramer family had settled into their new home at the end of Gallows Lane and were enjoying their new surroundings. Emily and Greg had made new friends, and they too were enjoying the field and nearby forest that provided hours of hiking and exploring. It was on one of these hikes that Greg would see something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had been hiking alone, exploring the forest around his home. On his return journey, he stopped at the edge of the woods where the thick tree line met the field. Looking across the field, he saw dozens of people wandering around his house. Dozens of men, women, even children. He had no idea who they were or why they were there. He recognized no one. Greg started to cross the field, his eyes focused on the group of people that walked slowly around the house. And then he did see someone he recognized. His mother. Her back was to him, hanging clothing on a clothesline with a basket of laundry at her feet. And while Greg watched, she reached into the basket and picked up another article of clothing, pinning it to the line. All the while, strange people walked through the yard, some of them only a few feet from his mother. Yet she paid no attention to them. It was as if she didn't even see them. As he drew closer, the crowd of people began to move. They were now walking in his direction, heading right for him, moving slowly, dreamily, as if they were in a trance or under some sort of spell. Greg stopped and watched the group coming toward him. Behind the crowd, his mother had picked up the laundry basket and was walking back into the house. She turned her head and spotted Greg and gave him a wave. Greg returned the wave, his arm moving sluggish and slow. It's like she doesn't even see them, he thought. The crowd was drawing closer and closer, but an odd thing began to happen. The people appeared to be shrinking. They seemed to be getting smaller and smaller. Then Greg realized that the people weren't getting smaller. They were sinking into the earth, sinking like they were in water. Within seconds, the mysterious crowd of men, women, and children had vanished into the earth. Greg stood in the field for a long time before starting out toward his house. His eyes searched the thick grass that licked at his legs, looking for some clue as to what might have happened to the people. They left no footprints that he could see, nor did the long grass look disturbed. It was as if the people hadn't been there. Was he going crazy? Had he only imagined he'd seen the crowd of people? All in all, there had to have been nearly 50 men, women, and children. Upon arriving at his house, he found his mother in the kitchen. He asked her if she'd seen anything strange outside. She said no. She did, however, see a deer in the field earlier that day. But to Greg, a deer wasn't anything strange, and certainly not as strange as the crowd he'd seen. Were they ghosts? Greg wondered. Is that what I saw? Although Greg didn't really think ghosts were real, he had no other explanation for what he'd seen. And then he remembered what his little sister had claimed to have seen the week previous. Emily had claimed she'd seen a young woman, perhaps a ghost, outside in the field. The ghost had even talked to her. He didn't believe her, and neither did her mother or father, for that matter. But that very night, something would happen at the Kramer home that would make all of them, including their mother and father, realize that Emily had been right after all. It was nearly midnight. Everyone was in bed, asleep, and the house was quiet. Windows were open, and cool night air breathed through the screens, gently billowing the curtains. Greg suddenly found himself wide awake. He was staring up at the ceiling, not knowing what had caused him to awaken so abruptly. He closed his eyes and tried to get back to sleep, but he remained wide awake. And so, he got up and decided to get a glass of water. A glowing nightlight at the top of the stairs provided enough light for him to find his way. When he made it to the first floor, the light of the moon illuminated the house in a murky blue glow. He strode into the kitchen. Standing before the sink with a glass, he held it under the faucet and looked out the window above the counter. There in the field stood a group of people, the same group of people he'd seen earlier in the day. His blood ran cold and he gasped. He dropped the glass and it shattered in the sink. The group of people remained in the field and their bodies seemed to glow in the moonlight. He could see them as clearly as he had seen them that afternoon. Men, women, children, simply standing in the field, looking at him, he was sure. They could see him in the house, standing at the window, staring at them. He wanted to run, to scream, but his horror was so great that he could do nothing. Water from the faucet continued to run, pouring over the shards of broken glass. Suddenly, he heard a noise from the stairs and it broke the spell he was under. He turned to see his mother and father hurrying down the stairs. They had heard the shattering glass and had come down to investigate. Without saying a word, Greg slowly raised his hand and pointed out the kitchen window. His mother and father looked where he was pointing, and there was no doubt that they too saw the same thing that Greg was seeing. His mother gasped and placed a hand to her mouth. His father flinched and leaned closer to the window. Then he walked over to the open sliding glass door. He drew open the screen and spoke. "What do you want?" he called out to the group of people in the field. When there was no answer, he called out again louder. "What do you want?" Then they heard the voice of a man calling back.
"This is not your home."
"Yes, it is," Mr. Kramer called back. Then, in unison, the entire crowd said,
"This is not your home."
They repeated this over and over and over.
"This is not your home."
Greg, his mother, and his father could do nothing but stare as the mysterious group of people chanted over and over again.
"This is not your home."
One by one, their voices died away as they simply sank into the earth, Soon there was nothing in the field but long, still grass, glowing blue gold in the light of the moon. The next morning, Mr. Kramer began investigating by traveling to neighboring houses, inquiring about the strange things that they'd seen. However, no one seemed very anxious to speak to him, and they all seemed to be hiding something, as if they knew something about what the Kramer family experienced but didn't want to talk about it. Finally, in a house nearly a mile away, he met an old man who explained what had happened at the home the Kramer family was living in. Apparently, years and years ago when the home was built, there was a graveyard in the field. The family who constructed the house soon decided they did not want to see a cemetery every time they looked out the window. One day, they simply plucked out all of the heavy gravestones, loaded them in wagons, took them far into the woods, and dumped them. That very night, and every night afterwards, the ghosts of the people in the cemetery began to appear, wandering outside of the house, banging on the walls and windows, demanding that the family leave. They had been agitated by the family's actions of removing the gravestones and disturbing their final resting place. The haunting became unbearable, and soon the family packed all of their belongings and left, never to return again. In the years that followed, every family that had ever moved into the home had left within a few months, scared off by the wandering ghosts, including the Kramers. That very day, they packed up everything. They moved away and never again returned to the house at the end of Gallows Lane.